Chapter 3 of Book 8 of Topics by Aristotle, translated by Octavius Owen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards. Chapter 3 of Dialectic Argument generally. Notwithstanding, it is difficult to attack and easy to maintain the same hypothesis. Such are those which are first and last naturally, for those which are first require definition, but the last are concluded through many things by him who wishes to assume continuously from the first, or the arguments appear captious, as we cannot demonstrate anything without beginning from appropriate principles, and continuing in a regular series, as far as the last. Respondents, therefore, neither think fit to define, nor consider whether the questionist defines. But when it is not evident what the proposition is, it is not easy to attack it. Now, such a thing especially occurs about principles, for other things are demonstrated through these, but these cannot possibly be through others. But it is necessary to make known each thing of this kind by definition. Those also are difficult to impugn which are very near the principle, since it is impossible to provide many arguments against them, since there are but few media between the thing itself and the principle, through which it is necessary that things subsequent to them should be demonstrated. Still, of all definitions, those are most difficult to impugn which employ such names as at first are uncertain whether they are predicated simply or multifariously, besides which it is unknown whether they are predicated by the definer properly or metaphorically, for from their obscurity a person does not obtain arguments, but from his being ignorant whether such things are said metaphorically, he is without reprehension. In short, every problem, when it is difficult of opposition, must be supposed either to stand in need of definition, or as among the number of things predicated multifariously, or metaphorically, or as not remote from principles, or from its not being first apparent to us, to which of the before named modes, this very thing which occasions the doubt is to be referred. For, the mode being evident, it is clear that it will be necessary either to define or to divide, or to prepare middle propositions, since through these the last are demonstrated. In many theses, also, when the definition is not well delivered, it is not easy to discourse and argue, as whether one thing is contrary to one or many things. But contraries being defined properly, we can easily collect whether there can be possibly many contraries of the same thing or not. In the same way also as to other things which require definition, and in mathematics some appear not easily described through a defect of definition, as that a line which laterally cuts a superficies divides similarly both a line and a space. When, however, the definition is stated, the assertion is forthwith evident, for both the spaces and the lines have a correspondent division, but this is the definition of the same sentence. In short, the first elements, when definitions are laid down, as what is a line and what a circle, are easy of demonstration, except that we cannot advance many arguments against each of these, from there not being many media. But if the definitions of the principles be not laid down, it is difficult, and perhaps altogether impossible. Likewise also in those which belong to disputations. It ought not, therefore, to escape us, that when a thesis is opposed with difficulty, it has experienced some one of the above-mentioned modes. Since, however, it is more difficult to discuss an axiom and a proposition than a thesis, a person may doubt whether things of this kind are to be laid down or not. For if he does not admit them, but thinks fit to discuss this also, he will enjoin a greater work than what was at first laid down. But if he does admit, he will believe from things less credible. If, then, we ought not to make the problem more difficult, that axiom must be laid down, but if it is necessary to syllogize through things more known, it must not be laid down, or must it not be posited by the learner, except it be more known, but must be laid down by him who exercises himself, if it only appear true, so that it is evident that the querist and the teacher ought not similarly to require a thing to be laid down. Chapter 4 of Dialectic Responsion. Almost sufficient, then, has been said as to how it is necessary to interrogate and arrange, but about reply we must first determine what is the employment of him who answers rightly, as also of him who rightly interrogates. Now it is the duty of the interrogator so to induce the argument as to make the respondent assert the most incredible things of those which are necessary through the thesis, but of the respondent to take care that the impossible or the paradoxical do not seem to result through him, but through the thesis, since perhaps it is another fault to place that first which ought not to be so, and not to keep what is laid down in a proper manner. Chapter 5 Various Objects in Disputation of the Thesis, etc. Since the several particulars are indefinite which should be observed by those who dispute for the sake of exercise and experiment, for the same objects are not proposed to the teacher or the learner, and to those who contend, nor to both these, and to those who practice with each other for the sake of inquiry, for to the learner always things which appear true are to be laid down, since no one attempts to teach a falsity, but of those who contend it is necessary that the querist should altogether seem to do something, but the respondent appear to suffer nothing. Yet in dialectic associations it has not yet been distinctly explained by those who dispute, not for the sake of contest, but of experiment and inquiry, what the respondent ought to aim at, also what to concede and what not, in order to preserve the thesis well or ill. Since then we have nothing delivered by others, we shall endeavour to say something ourselves. The respondent then is required to sustain the dispute, a probable or improbable thesis, or neither being laid down, and which is either simply or definitely probable, or improbable, as to a certain person, whether himself or another. In what way it is probable or improbable makes no difference, as the method of answering well, and of granting or not granting the question, will be the same. If then the thesis is improbable, it is necessary that the conclusion be probable, but if that is probable, that this should be improbable, for the querist always concludes the opposite of the thesis. If, however, what is laid down be neither improbable nor probable, the conclusion also will be of this sort. But since he who syllogizes properly demonstrates the proposed question from things more probable and better known, it is evident that when what is laid down is simply improbable, the respondent must not grant either that which does not seem simply, nor that which seems indeed, but is less apparent than the conclusion. For the thesis being improbable, the conclusion is probable, so that it is necessary that all the assumptions should be probable, and more so than what is proposed, if what is less known is to be concluded through things better known. Wherefore, except such a thing as this is amongst the things questioned, it must not be laid down by the respondent. But if the thesis be simply probable, it is clear that the conclusion is simply improbable. Whatever then seems true must be laid down, and of those which do not appear true, such as are less improbable than the conclusion, for it will appear then that the disputation has been sufficiently well conducted. In like manner, if the thesis be neither improbable nor probable, for thus all things apparent must be admitted, and of those which do not appear, such as are more probable than the conclusion, for thus it will happen that the arguments will be more probable. If then what is laid down be simply probable or improbable, we must make a comparison with reference to those which appear simply true. But if what is laid down be not simply probable or improbable, but to the respondent it must be laid down or not, with reference to him deciding what appears and what does not appear. If, moreover, the respondent defends the opinion of another, it is clear that the several particulars must be laid down and denied, looking to the conception which he forms. Wherefore, they who entertain strange opinions, e.g., that good and evil are the same, as Heraclitus says, do not admit that contraries are not simultaneously present with the same thing, not as if this did not seem so to them, but because, according to Heraclitus, so it must be asserted. They also do this who receive theses from each other, since they conjecture what he who lays the thesis down will say. Chapter 6. Certain rules as to admissible points. It is evident, then, what the points are which the respondent should direct his attention to, whether what is laid down be simply probable, or is so to a certain person. Since, however, every question must be, of necessity, either probable or improbable, or neither, also must pertain either to the disputation or not, if indeed it be probable and not relevant to the argument, it must be admitted when it has been stated that it is probable. But if it be improbable and irrelevant to the argument, it must be admitted indeed. Yet we must signify besides that it does not seem probable for the sake of avoiding silliness. If, on the other hand, it does belong to the argument and is probable, we must say that it seems indeed, but is too near to the original proposition, and that this being admitted, the position is subverted. Still, if it be relevant to the argument, but the axiom be very improbable, we must say that from this position a conclusion indeed follows, but that what is proposed is very silly. And if it be neither improbable nor probable, if indeed it is in no respect relevant to the argument, we must grant it with no definition. But if relevant to the argument, we must signify that the original position is subverted from this being laid down. For thus the respondent will seem to suffer nothing through himself, if the several things be laid down with foresight, and the interrogator will obtain a syllogism when all things more probable than the conclusion are admitted by him. Nevertheless, it is clear that they do not syllogize well, who endeavour to argue from things more improbable than the conclusion, wherefore they must not be conceded by the questionists. Chapter 7. The practice of the respondent in cases of ambiguity. Likewise, we must meet those things which are obscurely and multifariously enunciated, for since it is allowed to the respondent, if he does not comprehend, to say, I do not comprehend, and if a thing be multifariously predicated, not to confess or deny it of necessity, it is clear that, first, if the statement be not lucid, he must not hesitate to say that he does not understand it, since frequently from persons interrogated, not clearly conceding, some difficulty occurs. If, however, a thing multifariously predicated be known, if too what is asserted be in all things true or false, it must be simply admitted or denied, or if it be partly false and partly true, we must moreover signify that it is multifariously predicated, and why it is partly false and partly true. For if this distinction is made afterwards, it will be doubtful whether he, the respondent, perceived the ambiguity at first. Now, if indeed he did not foresee the ambiguity, but laid down the position looking to the other signification, it must be said against him, leading to the other, that he granted, without looking to this, but to the other of the things signified. For since there are many under the same name or sentence, a doubt easily occurs. Still, if the question asked be clear and simple, the answer to it must be yes or no. Chapter 8. Of Responsion to Induction. Since every syllogistic proposition is either some one of the things from which a syllogism is formed, or is assumed for the sake of one of them, For it appears manifest when it is assumed for the sake of one of them, i.e. from many things of a similar nature being interrogated, since men assume the universal, for the most part, either through induction or through similitude. Therefore, all the several particulars must be laid down, if they be true and probable. Yet we must make an attempt to urge an objection against the universal, for without an objection, either real or apparent, to impede the argument is to be perverse. If then, where many things appear, a person does not admit the universal, having no objection, it is clear that he is perverse. Moreover, if he has no argument on the contrary to show that it is not true, he will seem much more perverse. Yet neither is this enough, for we have many arguments opposed to opinions, which it is difficult to solve, as that of Zeno, that nothing can be moved, nor pass through a stadium. Still, things opposite to these are not on this account to be laid down. If then a person does not admit, when he has neither an objection nor a contrary argument, he is evidently perverse. For perversity in argument is a responsion contrary to the stated modes, destructive of syllogism. Chapter 9. Of the defense of the thesis. We ought so to maintain both the thesis and the definition that he, the respondent, may previously argue against himself. For, from what the questionists subvert the position, it is clear that to these opposition must be made. Still, we must be aware of maintaining an improbable hypothesis, and it may be improbable in two ways. For both that it is improbable from which absurdities happen to be enunciated, as if some one should say that all things are moved, or that nothing is, and also whatever things are chosen by the more depraved disposition, and which are contrary to the will, as that pleasure is the good, and that to injure is better than to be injured. For men hate a person who makes these assertions, not as maintaining them for the sake of argument, but as would approve themselves to him. Chapter 10. Of the solution of false arguments, and of the methods of preventing the conclusion. Whatever arguments collect the false must be solved by subverting that from which the falsity arises. For the solution is not effected by subverting anything whatever, even if what is subverted be false. For an argument may contain many falsities, as if some one assumed that he who sits writes, but that Socrates sits, since it follows from these that Socrates writes. When then it is subverted that Socrates sits, the argument is not the more solved, though the axiom is false. Still, not on this account is the argument false, for if any one happened to be sitting indeed, but not writing, the same solution would no longer be suitable to such an one, so that this is not to be subverted, but that he who sits writes, since not everyone who sits writes. He then altogether solves the argument who subverts that from which the falsity arises, but he understands the solution who knows that the argument depends on this, as happens in the case of false descriptions, since it is not sufficient to object, not even if what is subverted be false. But we must show why it is false, for thus it will be evident whether a person makes the objection from foreseeing something or not. It is possible, notwithstanding, to prevent an argument being conclusive in 4 ways, either by the subversion of that whence the falsity proceeds, or by urging an objection against the questionist. For frequently, when no solution is given by the respondent, yet the querist can proceed no further. Thirdly, by objecting against the interrogations made. For it may happen what we wish may not arise from the questions because they are improperly made, yet when something is added, that a conclusion may result. If then the querist can proceed no further, the objection would lie against the querist, but if he can, against the questions asked. The fourth and worst objection is that which relates to time. For some object such things as require more time for discussion than the present exercise admits. Objections, then, as we have said, arise in 4 ways, but of the particulars mentioned, the first alone is a solution, the rest being certain preventions and hindrances to the conclusions. End of chapter 10 of book 8. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards.